Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Everqueen in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 56. Oh, mother, please forgive us. Mother Isha, thank you dash. Mother. Craft World Yandin was a miracle of Yildari craftsmanship. Sung into existence by the finest shipwrights of the Dominion, it was a vessel of living, breathing crystal the size of a continent, shielded by an array of force fields protecting it from the vacuum of space far better than any physical barrier ever could. What it was not, however, was a warship. Craft worlds were vessels meant for trade and exploration, and also essentially as mobile colonies. Accordingly, they were designed primarily for speed and comfort. That is not to say they were defenseless. The galaxy had never been truly, completely safe even at the height of the Dominion's might, and it would have been foolish to build vessels equipped with no arms whatsoever. There were inbuilt defense systems far surpassing the technology of the younger races, and a legion of psychomatons on board, ready and able to defend the craft world from any threat that it might encounter. Nevertheless, a craft world was not a warship. It was not meant to endure alone in a galaxy in flames, and it had certainly not been meant to survive the destruction of the Dominion. That it had was a testament to the courage and resourcefulness of her children. But it had not survived those ages unscathed. The vessel was battered and bleeding, its people even more so. And thus Isha did her best to smile as she walked around the craft world, soothing the people of Yandin and healing whatever she could. It was difficult. Both because of her mood, and the Emperor's presence nearby in the warp, still burning brightly with wounded rage. But she had to try. Tell us a story, mother. Isha smiled at the small child in front of her, his bright blue eyes wide and eager as he looked up at her. Story. The boy's friends cried as well, and soon there was a chorus of children clamoring for her attention. Of course, little one, she murmured, reaching out to ruffle a head of fluffy silver hair with her free hand, the other one cradling a sleeping toddler. Let me tell you the story of Kael'dir Dragon Tamer, and how he first befriended the great dragons of old. The crowd of small faces stared at her, enthralled as Isha wove her tale, even as her heart ached at the thought that she would have to leave them alone again, soon. Still, she continued the story. When Draenir, the father of dragons, and Kael'dir first met, they did not like each other very much. Draenir thought Kael'dir was an arrogant young upstart. Kael'dir saw only an old, arrogant creature distant from the realities of the world. But they would soon become the closest of friends, brothers in all but blood. A gentle breeze blew through the garden, as Isha continued to weave her tale for some time, even as the children slowly fell asleep on the soft green grass. And then, the two of them promised eternal friendship and peace between their people, swearing to come to each other's defense whenever they were needed. Isha finished with a soft smile as the last of the children, the silver-haired boy who had asked for it in the first place, dozed off, his eyes fluttering shut. May I? A voice asked from behind her, and Isha turned to its owner, the caretaker, a kindly-looking man with soft brown hair and amber eyes, dressed in vibrant green robes that almost blended in with the garden and trees around them. He was not short for an Eldar, but in her natural form, Isha towered far above her children, and even sitting cross-legged on the ground as she was, the caretaker was barely eye level with her. He nodded to the toddler in her grasp, and with only a little reluctance, Isha relinquished the child, who grumbled and clutched at her dress with small hands for a moment but settled swiftly into his caretaker's arms. You have all done well caring for these children, Imladrik, Isha said. I am proud. Imladrik blushed slightly as he smiled, another Eldar coming up from behind him to gather the children and herd them off to bed. Thank you, mother. I am glad you came to see us here. It has been a difficult few millennia, he said quietly, gently stroking the toddler's hair. There are far fewer children than there once were, and raising them is harder, with so many people occupied with other duties, to try to keep us alive. Isha smiled sadly. I am sorry, my son. But you have done the best you can with limited resources. Child rearing had long been a communal activity among the Yildari, and she was glad to see the tradition endured still, even if there were fewer people available than there should have been. I have faith in you, and I believe you will all do the best in the years to come, Isha continued, letting her power flow across the caretakers, gifting small, almost unnoticeable blessings to them, which would strengthen their resolve, give them more energy, and allow them greater insight into the moods of the children. It wasn't much, but she dared not give out too many blessings at the moment. "Come, Imladrik," she said, rising to her feet, brushing the grass off her dress and beckoning to him. "Tell me more of your problems, and let us see what we can do about them." Imladrik beamed and nodded, and Isha followed him as he began to speak. But even as one part of Isha stayed focused on the children, another part of her was far away. Isha frowned as she looked at the legion of psychometons in front of her, examining them carefully. The word psychometon had always been a singular name for a large and diverse group of automata, and even though Yanden's psychometon legions were but a shadow of what they had once been, they were no exception. In front of Isha stood not only faceless crystal knights but also small yet lethal fighter ships that could cut far larger vessels to shreds, hovering spirit drones in the shape of large spheres, and more. The one thing they all had in common was the gleaming crystalline wraith bone they had all been grown from. There were well over 1,000 of them, all of them arrayed in the cavernous halls below Yanden's surface, but that was still far too few. The halls were large enough to accommodate 20 times the number of psychometons in front of her, but all those were gone. This had once been a production facility for such constructs, but the forges were all badly damaged, still showing signs of the backlash from the destruction of the Dominion's eternal matrix. Some had been rebuilt, and there were Bonzingers at their stations, trying to craft new weapons and defenses even as they all cast her worshipful looks, but the repairs were obviously improvised, and what weapons the forges could turn out were far inferior to true psychometons. And of the remaining psychometons, even the ones still functioning were damaged and broken in several places, suffering from the same backlash that ailed the forges and the many other trials over the eons. The ones that were not intact were practically in ruins, barely held together by patchwork repairs. "Can you heal them, Mother?" Inveril asked hopefully, Fleet Marshal Cernala standing behind him, her arms crossed. "I can," she nodded. The psychometons were all wraith bone, after all, and unlike the human automatons, there was an organic component there that would let Isha restore them to full strength easily enough. It also helped that the psychometons in front of her were of relatively low grade and quality. They would still be a formidable force once repaired, easily the match of the Emperor's super soldiers, but they were hardly the pinnacle of the weapons her children had built, never mind what Vol had been capable of. "I cannot build new ones, however," she continued. "That would take more time and effort than I can spare for now." She could work out the process of building automatons with the Bonzingers of Yanden, of that Isha was sure, but that would mean staying on Yanden for longer than the Emperor would permit. Years, perhaps. Not to mention, Isha was not sure whether or not the Emperor would take it as a provocation if she started constructing an army of psychic automata at his doorstep. She was already pushing her boundaries by repairing these, given his foul mood, but she could not simply leave her children with their current meager defenses. A mixture of disappointment and relief crossed Inveril and Cernala's faces, but they both nodded. Stepping forward, Isha clapped her hands, releasing a wave of power to reshape reality to her will. At her command, atoms began binding with each other again. Cells started replicating rapidly at her encouragement and the crystal began to grow back, artificial limbs and lost wings regrowing as though they had never been gone. The psychometons almost seemed to stand taller and prouder as their limbs were repaired and the wounds filled in. Their programming and instructions required some repairs as well, and Isha soothed the wounded spirits of the psychometons, patting them and healing them the same way she would have done with her husband's hunting hounds, once upon a time. And just like those hounds, the spirits responded eagerly to her touch, leaning in and nuzzling as she restored them, filling in the gaps and removing the lingering marks of both Slaanesh and Cain's influence. At last, as she finished, the psychometons all lit up, all of them now glowing a soft green, humming with life. Inveril stepped forward eagerly. "Psychometons, report. Yanden Defense Squadron 28% active. All units operating at peak capacity. New primary controller designated, Isha, Everqueen, and Mother." The psychic broadcast from the psychometons made Inveril beam and Cernala smile faintly as they both turned to Isha with gratitude shining in their eyes. "Thank you so much, Mother," Inveril said. "This will make things so much easier." "I am glad to help," Isha said warmly, before turning to the fleet marshal. Cernala was a tall woman, broad for an Eldar, with shoulder-length dark hair tied back in a braid, and pale skin, clad in close-fitting blue and yellow armor. She would have been fairly unremarkable for an Eldar, if not for two things. One was the vicious set of scars across her face, which Isha was told had been carved by an orc warlord. And the other was her left arm, which had been torn off by some human pirate. Unable to regenerate the arm given Yandin's dwindling resources, Inveril had fashioned a wraith bone replacement. An arm of deep blue crystal not merely attached to the empty arm socket as a more primitive prosthetic might, but bonding with the flesh and growing into it. Cernula stiffened at Isha's attention as the goddess stepped closer to her, clearly uncertain. Of all the council, Cernula had been the most skeptical, even if she had not voiced it, regarding Isha with mingled hope and fear, the former not outweighing the latter as it did for the others. Isha could not blame her, but she needed her trust. "I can restore your arm and remove your scars if you would like," Isha offered gently. "It would only take a moment." Cernula hesitated, her face caught with conflicting emotions, but then she shook her head. "No. I am not ashamed of these scars, and I have no wish to pretend I never had them. I am proud to have borne them in Yandin's defense." "I understand," Isha nodded. She had heard similar things before, so this was not entirely surprising. "Now, tell me, Fleet Marshal, is there anything else I can do to enhance Yandin's defenses? I am open to all suggestions." Cernula nodded slowly. "I have a few ideas." Such a small, flickering thing. All Isha could think as she sat on the floor of the chamber and stared at the last ember of Asuryan's flame was that it was such a small, flickering thing. For as long as she could remember, Asuryan had been a great beacon, a cosmic flame so radiant and intense that it could blind anyone who dared look too closely at it. The Emperor of Heaven had always seemed unbreakable, unyielding, eternal, invincible. But in the end, he had not been. The Phoenix King had died, and all that was left was this one spark of his power. It was not like the Shard of Cain, not even a shadow of Asuryan. Even this temple was a small, humble thing, built in haste and with only a handful of priests to oversee it. And yet, Isha knew even a spark could become an inferno, under the right circumstances. This ember had already bound itself to Yandin and its people, Isha could tell. It reflected their hopes and dreams, their fears and despair. And the priests had told her it had burned more brightly and fiercely ever since she had arrived. Isha wasn't sure how she felt about that. She sighed wearily as she watched the flame continue to crackle, feeling the weight of the ages. Asuryan had been so many things to her, both good and bad, and she did not have the strength in her to sort out any of those feelings at the moment. But that aside, there remained one important question. Should she dare to take the ember? To claim it for her own, and make it a part of her? It would not be an easy or simple process, but she could do it. Unlike the Shard of Cain, this small flame had only the barest fraction of Asuryan's will. There was no danger of it overwhelming her, twisting her. But as with everything, the shadow of the Emperor loomed large. Isha was not sure how he would react to her attempt to absorb the flame. No, she doubted he would even let her complete the ritual to claim it in the first place. She would most likely have to claim the flame for herself in the future, but that day was not today. With one last glance at the flame, Isha allowed her projection to dissolve into a shower of green light, leaving it behind. And while her various projections tended to other tasks, Isha's primary avatar stood in the council chambers, speaking to the remaining leaders of the craft worlds. "I cannot stay," she said, her words somber but resolute. "I will not risk your lives by defying the Emperor any further. He is already angry enough as it is." Lord Kadath slammed his fist on the table. "Damn it all," he hissed, clearly furious. Not at Isha, but at the Emperor, at himself for his helplessness. How did a human god become so powerful? How did he incarnate? "I do not know all the details yet," Isha admitted. And given the Emperor's anger, she never might. But the fact remains that he is, while I am much diminished. I need his protection and his support. Is there no other way?" The priest of Asuryan asked bleakly, his eyes shadowed with despair. "The Shard of the Bloody-Handed One, and the Flame of Asuryan. Could they not help you? Could you not take their power and wield it?" "I am afraid not," Isha said gently. Absorbing the power of other gods is a long and risky process, and in any case, those are but mere embers. They will not raise me to a level capable of matching the Emperor's might. The priest slumped in his seat, his desire for a drink clear. Kadath was still fuming, his face red with rage but unwilling to be crass in Isha's presence. Melendri, however, leaned forward, her eyes cold and sharp. "What price do we have to pay for the Emperor to let you go, mother?" she asked, her voice quiet and firm. "I am willing to pay it, whatever it may be." "Melendri!" Kadath protested, jerking forward. "I will hear no objections," Melendri said coldly, fixing the self-styled lord with an icy glare. "We need Mother Isha. All of us, not just Iyanden, but all those Ildari that still love. Her presence is worth whatever price a barbarian god will demand." "I am touched, my children," Isha cut in, gently but firmly. "But it is not that simple. I am only safe because the Emperor shields me in both the Materium and Immaterium. I cannot survive without him. And if we are to survive and thrive in this age, I must have his alliance." "The webway dash," Melendri began, but Isha shook her head. "I could pour my whole self into the webway, but then I would be limited. I would not be able to leave or challenge the gods of chaos or rebuild my realms in the ether. I wish for you, my children, to not merely survive, but to live. To thrive. I will not cower in the webway when there are other options available. But being the Emperor's prisoner is not better." Melendri protested. "Yes, it is," Isha said evenly. "Not least because unlike running into the webway, it will not leave you all at the Emperor's mercy." Melendri stepped forward and knelt on one knee. "Mother Isha, please. If you die, then." "I will not die," Isha assured them quietly. Of that she was sure. She was too useful to the Emperor. "This is the best way forward, my children, even if it does not seem like it. And I will not go without helping you all." Melendri swallowed, the stoic mask cracking as tears gathered in her eyes. Isha stepped forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, and the same feeling echoed to Dream Spinner and Kadath as well, and across all of Iyanden. "Do not despair, my children. Have faith," she said softly. "Now, there is one last thing I must do before I leave." An hour later, Isha stood at the center of Iyanden, a crowd milling around her, staring at her with awe. Isha would have liked to speak to them, but what she was about to do would speak far louder than mere words ever could. Isha knelt on one knee, pressing her hand to the ground of Iyanden. The craft world was alive in a sense, forged from wraith bone as it was, but it was only an imitation of a true world. It could grow and heal, but it lacked the true spark of life. Time to change that. Letting her power flow through the craft world, Isha ignored the murmurs of awe and shock as the entirety of Iyanden began to glow a soft, gentle green. She could feel the Emperor's focus intensify, but she ignored that as well. Her power seeped into every last cell of Iyanden, and the craft world shifted and grew under her command. The wounds the vessel had suffered over the years knitted themselves together, cells reconnecting and regenerating. The neglected, decaying forests over Iyanden bloomed once more, as Isha called upon the echo of what they had once been in the warp, restoring their lost vitality and strength, reviving that which had died as black leaves turned verdant green, grey trunks became brown once more, and flowers sprouted everywhere. The tendrils of crystal linking Iyanden to the smaller craft world became great green vines, thick and strong, strengthening and multiplying as they all became entwined, truly binding the two craft worlds into one. And in front of Isha, a sprout emerged from the ground. Small and fragile, it swelled rapidly, becoming a great tree, its trunk stronger than any metal, rising high into the sky, as tall as Iyanden's tallest tower. Great branches with enormous green leaves emerged from the sides of the tree, but instead of fruit, the branches were heavy with glittering crystals in 1,000 colors and more, dreamstones for her children. And then the dreamstones began to fall, even as new ones grew almost instantly in their place, her children crying out in wonder and awe. But there was one last thing to do. At the heart of the craft world, Isha planted a seed. A spark of life. Quiet and small for now, but one that would grow and strengthen over time, becoming the guardian of Iyanden, protecting it for all time. A world spirit. She could not bring it to full maturity immediately in her diminished state, even if the Emperor had not been hovering nearby, his presence a guillotine waiting to descend over Yandan. But it would be there if her worst fears came to pass. Straightening, Isha smoothed her dress as her children laughed around her, snatching the dream stones out of the air or plucking them from the ground. These tears of mine will protect you from she who thirsts, my beloved children. Use them well. The words resonated across the craft world, in the heart and mind of every Eldar, and they all burst into either happy tears or raucous cheering. For the mother, for the Everqueen, for life. The chant erupted across the world, and Isha smiled at the renewed sense of hope and joy she had been able to give at least a fraction of her children. But her happiness was marred as the Emperor's presence loomed closer in the warp, the golden flames around her immaterial self tightening in a reminder. Her time was up, it seemed. 57. The instant they were back on Terra, the Emperor's presence pressed down on her like the gravity of a star, as Isha struggled not to keel over. You are to remain confined to your chambers until I say otherwise. He told her, his anger resonating around her once more, making the walls of his fortress tremble. He summoned the old, heavy, shackles that she had worn in her earliest days on Terra, pulling them from thin air and forcing them upon her wrists. Isha struggled to breathe as the shackles acted like a bear trap, clamping onto her wrists and digging into her very essence. But the Emperor was not done yet. His power flowed around them, solidifying and strengthening the wards around her rooms until Isha was almost entirely helpless, the stifling heat of his wards and the pressure of the shackles leaving her hardly better than a mortal. All your privileges are revoked, he said, her collection of plants bursting into golden flames, leaving behind nothing but dust and ashes. Do not test me again. With those words, the Emperor departed with a crack of thunder, leaving Isha on the floor of her chambers, fresh chains wrapped around her as she struggled to move. Betrayal. It was something the Emperor was all too familiar with. How many times had he been betrayed across the centuries? How many friends and allies had turned against him, becoming enemies he had to strike down? After the cybernetic revolt, he had sworn he would never allow himself to suffer such a thing again. And yet, he had. How had he allowed a xeno-warp construct to break past his defenses? How had he allowed himself to be so weak and foolish again? He wasn't even sure how he could get rid of her. She had made herself utterly critical to his empire, a pillar even more important than Malkador, perhaps. Utterly irreplaceable. He could not remove her influence and contributions without crippling the Imperium entirely. Damn her. Damn himself for being such a fool. Fresh precautions would have to be taken. Everything had to be revised. Malkador. Valder. Attend me. An hour later, the Emperor sat in the chair of his study, Malkador and Valder standing opposite him. Valder was stoic and imperturbable as always, but the gears of his mind were already turning, grinding like the finely honed machine he had been forged into as he considered this new information. Malkador, however, had his hand tightly clenched around his staff, eyes blazing with fury. She betrayed us, Malkador whispered furiously. We should have known. Indeed, the Emperor said, steepling his fingers. I want a permanent cadre of anathema psychona and custodes guarding her chambers. She is not to leave without my express permission and presence. And we must begin measures to reduce our reliance on her. Luna must be conquered as swiftly as possible. I will begin drawing up plans for the conquest of Luna, my lord, Valder nodded curtly. It will take some time to assemble the forces needed for such an assault, however. I have every faith in you, Valder, the Emperor responded. We must also accelerate work on the Silver Knights project. It must be completed as soon as possible. And I will be conducting a fresh review of all of Isha's work with a start, from top to bottom. Valder nodded, even as Malkador leaned forward. We should dispose of Isha immediately, the Sigillite said, a cold gleam in his eyes. It will be costly, yes, but we cannot trust her. The Emperor shook his head. Not yet. The Imperium must be weaned off her influence, first, then I will consider it. Furthermore, there may be more information I can extract from her with Yandan as a bargaining chip. No, Malkador disagreed. It's too risky. We should kill her immediately, and purge Yandan. Having a xeno-warp construct on Terra was folly, and so is having a craft world so close to Sol. We can make use of the vessel and its technology, but we should not allow Isha or her children to live. I understand your rage, my friend, but we should not let our rage provoke us to recklessness. The Emperor told him quietly, looking out the window at the sky, far clearer and bluer than it should have been. Not being careful enough is what led us to this folly in the first place. In any case, Isha imparted several gifts upon her children that would make any assault on them costly indeed, which might include further contingencies that would make it difficult even for me to purge Yandan. And you let her do this? Malkador demanded, astonished and incredulous. Why? The Emperor opened his mouth. I do not believe she will do anything to endanger her children or her agreement with me, was the response that immediately came to mind, but that wasn't true, was it? Isha had done something in violation of their agreement. I wished to see what she was capable of. The Emperor said instead. Where she would be willing to exert herself more, instead of being as cautious as she has been here. Malkador's expression made clear he didn't believe the Emperor for 1 second. We do not need such demonstrations. You should simply tear her mind apart for all her knowledge and dispose of her. Something inside the Emperor recoiled at the idea, even though he had threatened Isha and Yandan mere hours ago. I do not think that would be wise, he found himself saying. We must take a careful, measured response to this. I am being careful and measured in my response, Malkador argued, his voice annoyingly calm. When you agreed to grant Isha refuge, we discussed what would happen to her if she betrayed us, and she has now betrayed us. I do not see why we need to alter our plans now that we know she disobeyed your orders. Things have changed. When Isha first came, we were not as reliant on her as we are now. Letting her become so important to the Imperium was a mistake, but we must deal with the consequences of it nevertheless. The Emperor retorted, his irritation spiking at Malkador's words. Malkador regarded him with narrowed eyes, saying nothing for a long moment, but his thoughts and his heart were as clear to the Emperor as ever. When I said you should exploit her soft-heartedness, I did not mean you should let her melt your own heart like butter. Malkador did not voice these words, but the Emperor heard them nevertheless. I have done no such thing. The Lord of Terror roared, rising to his feet. Valdir was startled, for once in his life genuinely surprised at the Emperor's sudden outburst. But Malkador was uncowed. He was a veteran of the Iron Wars, a warlord of the Age of Strife, and perhaps the finest student the Emperor ever had. He was not easily shaken. You have, he said softly. You still trust her, don't you? That's why you don't want to kill her, why you let her strengthen Yandan's defenses. For once, the Emperor found himself at a loss for words. There were 1,001 responses he could have given to that. But none of them would be true, would they? A voice whispered in the back of his mind. In the end, there was only one response he could give. Do not forget your place, Malkador. His voice boomed like thunder, searing his intent into the Sigilite's soul. I tolerate a great deal from you, for you are my friend, but I am still your Emperor. Malkador fell to his knees, beads of sweat dripping down his face, clearly struggling to breathe under the weight of the Emperor's fury as even Valdir took a step back. Do not question me, and do not dare to think of disobeying me. Without waiting for a response, the Emperor vanished in a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder. He reappeared inside his private labs, still fuming. The Lord of Terra knew he should return to his campaign, to end it as swiftly as possible, but he needed to regain control of his temper. Why had he responded to Malkador's advice with such anger? The Sigilite had said nothing that the Emperor would not have said himself if their positions were reversed. One of the many reasons Malkador was his closest advisor was because the man was willing to offer honest criticism and advice to him. And yet, his words had stoked a rage in the Emperor's heart and had made him lash out at his oldest living friend. Why? The Emperor shook his head. He could mull over this later. Right now, he needed to focus on calming himself so that he could return to complete his campaign. Frightening his forces with his current mood would break morale and leave them disoriented and disorganized, and more than that, he did not wish to scare Horus. Just as Isha did not want you to scare her children. The voice in the back of his mind whispered, but the Emperor ruthlessly quelled that thought. It wasn't the same at all. He was not violating any agreement he had made with Isha. Except, he had promised Isha that he would not harm any of the Eldar if they approached Seoul, as long as they did not strike first. But he hadn't harmed them. Threatened, yes, but not harmed. Yet, would he have accepted the same argument if their positions were reversed, if Isha had been the one cowing the human world into submission with her power? The Emperor scowled to himself, pinching the bridge of his nose. It didn't help in any real way, he did not even have a headache, but it was a lingering habit from his youth when he had lived as ordinary men and women over and over again. Why was he suddenly plagued by doubt? Was Malkador right? Had he let Isha influence his judgment? He was softer than he had been 20 years ago, there was no doubt about it. The Order Hospitaller, his handling of Yandin, Horus. He would have handled all those things far differently only a short time ago. It had not even been a blink of an eye, relatively speaking, since he would have crushed Yandin without a second thought. But was he truly wrong to handle things the way he was doing now? The people of the Imperium were happy, Terra was healing, and his relationship with his son was steadily deepening. No, there were benefits to his approach that could not be denied. But still, was he just letting Isha manipulate him, instead of manipulating her as he had intended? He didn't know the answer to the question, and that disturbed him more than anything. A lie to oneself is still a lie. That little voice in the back of his mind said again. Shaking his head, the Emperor pushed all those thoughts aside. What was done was done. He needed to calm himself, and then he needed to return to finish the campaign. And working on one of his projects was always soothing, a reminder of better days when he could be a scientist and not a warlord. Looking around the lab for something to do, the Emperor's eyes landed on the pile of discarded crystals, his failed attempts at making dream stones. It wasn't exactly the sort of soothing distraction he needed, but the sooner he could make it work, the sooner the Imperium would be free of Isha's influence. Focusing upon his desire to protect humanity and ensure it could grow safely, to make it safe and independent from chaos and Xenos alike, the Emperor began to speak the melody that Isha had taught him, letting his emotions flow into the song, and the energy of the warp began to crystallize in front of him. But to his frustration, he immediately noticed the flaws in the crystal. It was even more of a failure than usual, marred by black streaks, his rage and bitterness bleeding into it. Growling, the Emperor stopped the melody, scowling as he snatched the crystal out of the air. It hummed with anger, his anger, in the palm of his hand. It was more likely to kill any ordinary psyker that held it than to help them. Disgusted, he ripped apart its atoms, letting it fade into dust. What was he doing wrong? Why did this come so easily to Isha, and not to him? It is too impersonal. Isha's words sprang to mind. The dreamstones are forged from equal parts love and conviction. Pinching the bridge of his nose again, the Emperor exhaled. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and centered himself. Another old habit he had never truly shaken off. Love. What did he love? Not the Imperium, not humanity, not memories of old friends dead and gone. None of those had worked. Horus. He loved Horus. He loved and cherished his son, and wished to see him prosper. Opening his eyes, the Emperor took another deep breath, and then began to sing. The melody that sprang from his lips wasn't a famous song. It wasn't meticulously composed and crafted, almost crude in comparison to the elegance of the work of the great musicians. It was a lullaby, one that he had sung lifetimes ago to his children, when he had still been a mortal, ignorant of his true nature, and had simply been a tired mother singing her child to sleep. Yet somehow, the chant was more resonant, deeper, and more powerful than last time as he thought of Horus, and his hopes and dreams for his child. Of how happy he had been to find Horus, of apologizing to him, of taking him out on that excursion into the city. The smile and shining joy on his son's face, the feeling of his hair under the Emperor's hand. The memory of Horus as an infant, looking up curiously at the Emperor from his cradle, tiny hands reaching out and grabbing in the air. The memory of all the other Primarchs, his sons, in the same room, sleeping peacefully. The memory of the fear and rage that had consumed his heart when the Four stole his children. The melody echoed in the lab, and the Immaterium, and the daemons fled from it, even more so than they usually did from his presence. And in front of him, a glowing golden crystal began to materialize, slowly rotating, and forming, inch by painstaking inch. The process took nearly an hour, but at last, a warm golden crystal hovered in front of the emperor as he finished the lullaby. Reaching out with one hand, he plucked it from the air, feeling it hum softly in his palm, forming a shield around him. One he did not need, but it would do the same for any human who held it. He had done it, at last. The emperor blinked, raising his other hand to his face as he realized it was wet with tears, ones that he had not even noticed as he created the dream stone. He understood now, the emperor admitted to himself. He understood how Isha made those dream stones, and the emotions that went into them. He understood her feelings towards her children, and why she had sent them that message. He would have done the same in her place, he had just not wanted to admit it. Isha had broken their agreement, but she had not done so out of malice, nor had she truly done him any harm. He truly understood her better now than he ever had before. The only question was, what was he going to do about it? 58. Isha did not know how long she stayed there, choking under the stifling heat of the wards, held by the shackles wrapped around her wrists. The heat of the wards receded after a while, strangely enough, no longer strangling the life out of her. But Isha still could not find it in herself to get up, held down not only by the chains, but the thick blanket of despair that had settled across her. All her dreams and hopes of saving her children, of avenging her family, seemed far out of reach now. She was once more a slave, just as she had been during the war in heaven, bound to the will of a cold and capricious master who only saw her as a tool to further his own goals. And this time, she did not even have her family or friends to share her burden. Kurnus, Val, Hoth, Mother, Gorka Morka, even Asurian, none of them were here. She was utterly alone, a slave making more slave soldiers for her overlord. Just like all the countless trillions of her children she had created and sent to die against the Ingur, who had never known anything except war until their flesh was torn apart and their souls devoured. What was she going to do? She simply lay there, unable to find a way out of the haze that had consumed her, until the doors of her chambers swung open. Lady Isha, came the voice of a custodes she did not recognize. And with him was another presence, a dark void that muffled the screams of the warp, yet also laid another weight upon Isha's shoulders. The Emperor requests your presence. Dully, tiredly, Isha pulled herself to her feet. Whatever else, she could hardly afford to anger the Emperor any further. There were two custodes in her chambers, accompanied by what Isha recognized as the Emperor's Null Maidens, the Sisters of Silence. They were clad in golden armor of their own, smaller and sleeker than that of the custodes, but nevertheless formidable. Masks concealed their faces, but could not conceal the dark aura that they all radiated. The leader of the Null Maidens was the most powerful of them all, a woman with a long, wild red mane of hair. Powerful enough to affect even greater daemons and practically invisible to mortals. Combined with the wards and the shackles, it was no wonder she had been sent by the Emperor to escort her. But Isha could not find it in herself to care. She simply nodded tiredly to the custodes. Of course. They surrounded her and led her down the hallways of the palace in a tight formation, and Isha trudged along as she wondered what in the world the Emperor wanted. Soon, they arrived at their destination. This was a part of the fortress she had never been to before. The doors were still ornate and decorative, marked, but, smaller than she was used to, crafted from some polished wood etched with golden sigils rather than stone and metal. And she could feel the Emperor's burning presence inside. Isha swallowed, but could not stop for even a moment as the doors swung open and her guards led her inside. The chambers inside were not something she expected at all. They were large, as to be expected from the Emperor, but not cavernous. There were expensive decorations, from the thick red carpet that muffled even the sounds of the custodes' footsteps, to the paintings on the walls, the large windows framed with gold and gems that stretched from the ground to the roof, and the golden chandeliers that hung from the ceiling. But there were no war trophies, nor banners. None of the portraits depicted a battle or a diplomatic meeting or anything of that sort, only people, animals, and landscapes. There were several other doors leading deeper inside, but Isha's eyes were drawn to the center of the room. There was a large, thick board in the center, easily twice as wide as Isha was tall in her human form, painted with rich black and gold squares. And atop the board were gleaming statues of obsidian and gold, wearing rich, colorful clothes and with gems for eyes, wielding shining swords and staffs. Some were simply clad in robes, standing, others wore crowns, and a few statues even depicted an armored warrior astride a horse. No, not statues. Isha realized. Game pieces. This was a life-sized version of a human game. Regicide, Isha believed it was called, though this version seemed a little different than the one she had read about in the small library of human writings the Emperor had granted her. An older version, perhaps. On both sides of the board, there were two large chairs, practically wooden thrones, with rich red cushions on them. The chair behind the black pieces was empty, but the Emperor sat on the chair behind the golden pieces. He was dressed more informally than she had ever seen him before, clad in neither his golden armor, nor the black uniform he usually wore, but a simple white robe. A toga, if Isha remembered correctly. Though he seemed calm, Isha could not help the trickle of fear that crawled down her spine, but she raised her chin and refused to let it show. "Isha, welcome," the guardian said quietly. "Leave us," he directed to her golden armored guards, who obeyed promptly, backing away and leaving the two of them alone. With a flick of his wrist, the Emperor released the shackles around Isha's own, which fell to the floor. Isha jolted in surprise, rubbing her wrists and eyeing the Emperor in surprise, but he did not seem to take notice, simply waving at the empty throne. "Please, sit." Isha obeyed warily, walking across the room and sinking into the chair. "What is this about?" she wondered. "Are you familiar with this game?" the Emperor asked, staring at her intently from across the board. He was taller than the pieces, and Isha felt a little uncomfortable in her human form, so much smaller than him, but she dared not assume a shape equal to his height. "Regicide, is it not?" she ventured warily. "I understand it is fairly popular among humans." The Emperor smiled faintly. "Regicide is the latest version, yes. But the version here, the one that this board is made for, is called chess, a much older iteration from my youth. Malkador prefers regicide, but I must confess, I prefer the classic version. There is a certain charm to it that the newer variations lack." Isha nodded, uncertain of how he wanted her to respond. "Would you indulge me by playing a game?" the Emperor asked, leaning back in his chair. "I do not know how," Isha replied, hiding her confusion. Why was the Emperor speaking to her civilly once more? Why did he want to play an actual, human game with her? Try as she might, she could not puzzle out his reasoning. The Emperor waved his hand, and a thin book appeared in front of her, hovering in the air. "A beginner's manual," he said. "You should have no trouble absorbing it." Hesitating only for a moment, Isha reached out and grasped the manual, flipping through it quickly. It was a simple thing, meant to be easy for mortals and even easier for a god. She absorbed it swiftly, quickly understanding the goal and rules of the game. It was nothing very special, a flawed imitation of war that assumed both sides were constrained by specific rules they could never violate, but she could see the appeal of it, she supposed. Isha shut the manual, offering the Emperor a slight nod. "It is your move, first, I believe." The manual said the player with the white pieces began the game, and the Emperor's gold replaced those. The Emperor nodded his head and spoke, issuing a command. At his words, one of his pawns, a statue of a soldier clad in sleek armor, moved forward. Isha paused for a moment, wondering how she should play the game. If she defeated the Emperor, which was possible, if hardly a certainty, she did not know how he would react given his tempestuous mood yesterday. If she let him win, he would probably still be offended. A situation where she was likely to face another bout of cold fury regardless of what happened. Wonderful. Reluctantly, she gave a command to one of her pieces. Hopefully, her inexperience with the game meant the Emperor would win no matter how hard she tried. Taking a moment to analyze the pieces, Isha was faintly surprised to realize these were made from ordinary metals and clothes. She had assumed the Emperor had willed them into existence, but though the craftsmanship was superb, there were tiny flaws on the molecular level that revealed that these were mortal-made. And inside the pieces was complex machinery. For a moment, she almost thought they were war constructs of some sort, but no, they were too fragile. The technology inside was advanced but delicate, and the shell that held them was not durable enough to be used for war. Had the Emperor commissioned some mortal artisans to craft this for him? Strange. She knew he could be egotistical and prone to grand displays, but she had not thought him that self-indulgent. The game continued in silence for a few more moves and Isha could not focus her attention entirely on it, keeping an eye on the Emperor as she tried to understand what he was up to. "The chessboard was a gift to me," the Emperor said after a long silence, as he moved another piece. "From one of your vassals?" Isha asked, raising an eyebrow. That would explain the rather gaudy nature of it all, if it was some warlord seeking to gain his master's favor. To her surprise, the Emperor shook his head, the smile on his face widening. It was not an expression she had ever seen on him before, tinted with nostalgia and honest affection. It was almost how he looked at Horus, but sadder, more wistful. "No," he said softly. "It was given to me by some of my children several thousand years ago, long before the Iron War." His smile turned a little rueful. "They were aware of my fondness for gold, and thought it would be funny to give me something so ostentatious." "Ah. That explained the delicate machinery and expensive ornaments. Such technology and ornaments might have been rare and valuable in humanity's current state, but at their height, all this would simply have been a very gaudy toy. They did not expect me to be so fond of it," the Emperor continued wryly. "But I was. And I am even more so, now that they are gone." And he was. Isha could see how perfectly preserved the pieces and the board were. The Emperor might not have willed them into existence, but he had certainly expended enough power to keep this in flawless condition. But she still did not know exactly what he expected her to say. Before Yandan's arrival, she might have said something along the lines of how gifts from one's children were to be treasured, but now that seemed more likely to ruin the Emperor's mood than anything. "This game is almost childish, in a way," the Emperor said, abruptly changing the subject before Isha could decide on a response. "A fantasy of sorts. That war may be conducted within a strict set of rules, within a certain area, and none will or can break those rules in pursuit of victory." "That it is," Isha agreed cautiously, still baffled. "The game assumes that each piece, whether the pawn, the knight, or even the king and queen, is bound to the player's will. That they cannot function on their own, independently, to do anything that might go against the will of their master. Which works well as a conceit for the game, but it is also a mistake many leaders in real life have made, treating allies and followers as pawns to be moved around, who cannot and should not be allowed to act independently." The Emperor fell silent, his golden eyes looking away from her for a moment. "What I mean to say is," he said quietly, "that I am sorry." "What?" Isha stared at him blankly, completely unable to process what he said. Was this some joke? Another of his damned tests? An illusion of Tsintek? I had forgotten what it feels like to have your children beyond your reach, alone and afraid and in danger, and all you wish you could do was at least offer a few comforting words to them." The Emperor paused, then shook his head. "No, I had not forgotten. I merely chose to deny it, to refuse to understand your pain and your decision, when I would have done the very same thing in your position." He huffed a laugh. "If I was a prisoner, and humanity was broken and scattered and afraid, yes, I would have done the same thing. I cannot compel you to accept my apology, and I will not even try. But I do want you to know that I am sorry." Isha opened her mouth, but no words came out. She did not know what to say. To accept his apology? To be furious that he would dare to think a few simple words could make up for threatening her children with genocide? She truly did not know what to say or even think. In the end, only one question came to mind. "Why did you change your mind?" It was folly to ask, perhaps, but she could not contain herself. She truly did not understand what had brought this about. The Emperor coughed uncomfortably, a human pretense that Isha found distinctly disconcerting after he had let loose his strength at Yandan. But after a long moment, he raised his hand, drawing a golden crystal from thin air. "Because of this," he said softly. "A dreamstone." The Emperor had successfully conjured a dreamstone, and had finally made the leap that she had been trying to convince him to take for years now. Just after he had threatened her children with genocide, and forced her to agree to be a proponent of slavery and murder. Miserable, broken laughter erupted from Isha's throat, like the howl of a dying animal. The Emperor leaned back in his chair, eyes wide, but Isha could not stop the distorted mockery of laughter that erupted from her throat any more than she could stop the tears that flowed down her face. Was this how Hoth had felt? Was this why he had just given up and lost himself to madness, becoming Sigarik? Isha, the Emperor said softly, but trailed off, clearly unsure of what to say. Isha found that she could not respond. Could not stop laughing or crying. She was so tired. 59. With every sobbing gasp that left her throat, Isha felt her rage and despair deepen rather than abate. For years, she had bottled it all up, repressed it. Even before the fall, as she watched her children spiral into madness and decadence, she could not truly speak her mind to those she blamed for it, could not lash out at Cain or Asurian, or punish her children. How dare the Emperor demand so much of her? How dare her children even think to blame her for not saving them? She had done everything she could. She had offered the Emperor 100 secrets for which lesser gods would have killed worlds. She had endured ages of torment for daring to try to help her children at the hands of the monster that was her father, and had watched her brother sacrifice himself for it. And what had she gotten for it all? To become the Emperor's prisoner and slave? For her children to remember her for nothing except her tears? To reject her guidance because she did not approve of the rape, murder, and mutilation of innocent people? The Dominion had damned itself, and in her darkest moments, Isha could not help but think they had deserved it. That they deserved worse for destroying her family, for dragging the galaxy to the brink of ruin. And the Emperor. This insufferable child who dared to dictate to her as if he understood even a fraction of what she had been through. Who thought he could hold her leash and use her as an attack dog. How dare they? A part of her just wanted to let go. A part of her that was stronger than it had been since the war in heaven, the part that just wanted to stop caring because it hurt too much. For countless ages, everyone had berated her for her kindness, for her compassion, for daring to care and hold every life sacred. The Emperor was just another in a long line of them. Perhaps she should have listened to them. Perhaps if she had just let go, been her father's daughter, been the weapon of the old ones, she could have stopped all this. Usurped Asurian, brought her children to heel, and slain the Chaos Gods. She still could. If she so desired, she could conjure forth new weapon races the likes of which the galaxy had not seen since the war in heaven, and send them to march into the realms of chaos. She could subvert every super soldier the Emperor had crafted, turn Terra itself against him. She could unite her children by force, and bind them to her will so that they might never defy her. Even the Four would know to fear her legions and would be reminded that they were parasites who could never comprehend or understand what the war that had birthed them had truly been like. Even if she did not win, even if she died as she most likely would, at least she would have her revenge and would have made her enemies feel some fraction of the pain and sorrow that had haunted her for so long. Hate and despair and rage bubbled in her chest, curdling into a poison that threatened to burst out and consume the world. But one thing kept it at bay. The memory of those small children on Iyanden, on Terra. Those innocents who had done nothing deserved no harm or blame for the crimes of their elders and masters. Yet, even as she reminded herself of that, Isha could not restrain the bitterness in her entirely. It was too much, it had been held within for too long. The Emperor was watching her like a mortal might watch a wounded animal that might lash out at him, and something dark and ugly bubbled inside her, dictating her next words. "Why should I believe a word you say?" she asked derisively. "Yes, you have created a dreamstone, good for you. But that means nothing to me. Whatever emotion you drew upon to create that thing was certainly not affection for me or my people." "I will not deny that," the Emperor acknowledged quietly, looking at her with an infuriatingly calm expression. "But the creation of the Dreamstone did truly lead me to a realization, that I should have treated you better, that we can accomplish more as allies than as master and servant." This was the moment Isha had been working towards ever since she had landed on Terra, the very thing she had invested so much effort in, what she had pinned all her hopes on. And yet, now that it was here, she could not bring herself to believe it. "I don't believe you," she said coldly. "You have made it abundantly clear in how little regard you hold my life or my wishes. You promised me that you would not harm any of my children who came looking for me unless they attacked first, and you were perfectly willing to destroy Iyanden, to murder every last man, woman, and child on board, no matter how little a threat they posed to you. You have held their lives hostage to demand that I craft slave soldiers for you and give up yet more of my secrets. The emperor winced, but Isha refused to believe that was anything other than temporary. Whatever flash of guilt or remorse he was feeling right now would fade away and ultimately be irrelevant, just like every moment of camaraderie and empathy they had shared before Yi Yanden's arrival. She had been a naive fool to ever think she could trust the emperor. By coming here, she had placed more of her children at risk than she ever would have by seeking a webway gate and fleeing through it. The emperor was exactly like the old ones, exactly like Asurian, like Cain. His interests, his ideals, and his beliefs came first, and anyone who dared to disagree was, at best, a tool to be discarded when they became inconvenient. And damn if it didn't feel good to just let her rage run loose for once, the consequences be damned. I do regret what I did upon Yi Yanden, the emperor insisted. That was unworthy of me, especially after all that you have done for me. I should not have broken my word, and I should not have threatened the children upon the vessel. And I retract all the demands I made, truly. I will not force you to create slave soldiers, nor to act as my weapon. Isha let out another mocking laugh, another distorted howl that sounded more like Sigarak than anything else, a sound that made the room tremble and the immaterium ripple and twist. How convenient that you have found remorse after doing all those things, after threatening me and wrapping chains around me to show my subservience to you for all to see. It was not the wisest thing to say, perhaps. But what did she have to lose? At worst, her words would mean that the illusion of civility, the false hope of alliance and friendship, would be torn away. And Isha would rather live with the bitter truth, that the emperor would never see her as anything except a tool, than continue to cling to the idea that something more was possible. It was not as if her attempts to appeal to his better nature, to convince him of the value of compassion and cooperation, had accomplished anything so far. But the emperor only looked pained at her words, no hint of anger or frustration upon his face. I know, he said quietly, still frustratingly calm. I have given you no reason to believe I will treat you as an equal, as an ally. Which is why I have devised a solution to both of your problems. And what solution is that? Isha scoffed. Another agreement where I give you something you greatly desire, and you make a promise that you will break the next time it is inconvenient. An agreement, yes, the emperor said, dipping his head. He hesitated for a single moment before forging ahead, and this time, his words truly shocked Isha. But more than that. A pact, a binding covenant to ensure both of us keep our word. For a moment, Isha was truly speechless, but she quickly recovered. And what would the conditions of the pact be? That I be your faithful servant and you will be a gentle master. Isha sneered. While even gods could form binding pacts, Isha had never raised or even considered the idea because she had believed the emperor would never consent to have any restrictions upon him, to have any force other than his power enforcing the agreement. And even now, she could not believe he would consent to any sort of binding that would restrict him in any way. But the emperor's words were firm and clear, ringing with sincerity. No. I would have us be equals, entering a binding agreement that affects us both equally. Please, look at it. With a snap of his fingers, a glowing golden tablet roughly twice the size of his head appeared in front of Isha, and she took it warily, her eyes scanning the words, inscribed in the script of some ancient human language she did not know. But the meaning was clear in the warp, the thought, intent, and emotion behind them resonating in her mind. No ordinary mortal would be able to comprehend this, even if they knew the language the emperor had written it in, for there were far more words on the tablet than were visible through sight alone, a million golden runes shimmering in the dreaming. Even a powerful psyker like Malkador would have struggled to comprehend the sheer breadth and details the emperor had inscribed upon the contract he prepared. But the essentials were clear. Isha would have to abide by the same conditions she had already agreed to, supplying food, medicine, and knowledge, and not lie to the emperor or do anything that would harm the humans under his rule. Under the conditions of the contract, some of her previous actions, such as the message she had sent out to her children, would not be possible, but it was nothing new. The truly astonishing parts were the conditions the emperor had imposed upon himself. A promise to treat her as an equal, to never ask her for slave soldiers again, to not harm any of Yi Yanden's people as long as they remained in Alpha Centauri, to not eradicate or enslave the entire populace even if they did attack. And to not cast her aside, even if she was no longer useful. That she would have his protection and aid no matter what. In essence, they were the same terms he had always demanded of her, in how she should act towards him and humanity, but now he was willing to impose them on himself as well. Isha scanned the words as hard as she could. Sought any loophole, any gap, anything the Emperor could exploit to use against her. But she found nothing. She was not Liliath or Sigarak or Asuryan. Sarsraus pacts and laws had never been her area of specialty. Yet, she was still mother of the Eldar, an incarnate goddess with a mind that no mortal or mortal creation could ever hope to match. To fool her was a difficult task indeed. And nothing she could see in the contract was deceptive or cruel, meant to exploit her or leave the Emperor with the ability to violate it. It had been meticulously crafted, and its sincerity was painfully obvious. It truly would restrain the Emperor's actions, much as Asuryan's edict had restrained the entire Pantheon, if in a very different way. Her rage doused, Isha could only shake her head helplessly. If you wish to take time to consider the matter, that is all right, the Emperor said, watching her closely. I realize that this is quite a shock and that you have every reason to doubt my words. Isha struggled to think of what to say. The contract did mean a great deal and was a greater sign of the Emperor's sincerity than she could have dared to hope for. But at the same time, it did not erase his previous actions. Could she truly afford to take the time to consider, and not seize upon their opportunity? The Emperor had proven himself mercurial, and while she believed now that his remorse and desire to make amends was sincere, there was no guarantee of how long it would last. No. She had to seize this opportunity now, while it was there and before it faded away. No, she said finally. I am willing to agree to the pact now. Let us do it. The Emperor smiled, and his expression was more open and visibly relieved than she had ever seen it before, save when she had given him the confirmation that Horus was untainted. Thank you. Isha gave a curt nod, not trusting herself to speak. The Emperor rose to his feet, circling around his giant chessboard to stand in front of her. Isha briefly let go of the tablet, letting it rise back into the air, before placing her hand on it again at the same time as the Emperor did. For a long, awkward moment, the two of them stared at each other, and then they both channeled their power into it. No words were required to bind themselves, no verbal declarations or written signatures that meant less than nothing. All that was required, was intent and power. A storm of golden and emerald light erupted, swirling and crackling around them as their power poured into the tablet, initiating the contract, the ritual. The surge of power echoed in both worlds and in the distance, Isha could hear the shrieking of the dark gods. A good sign, she hoped. And as the contract was established, the storm shrank and coalesced, bands of golden energy wrapping around Isha's arm from fingertip to shoulder, the same happening to the Emperor, save the bands around his arm were a verdant green instead. If either of them dared to violate the contract, the price would be dire indeed. A weight settled upon Isha's essence in the immaterium, and she could see the same happening to the Emperor, the golden sun, not dimmed, but restrained, albeit willingly. And with a final flare of power, the contract was made. With that flare, came one last piece of understanding. The Emperor's name. Not his true name, not the one that would give others power over him, but a name he considered his own nevertheless, one sufficient for the contract. George. The name was so ordinary that Isha didn't know what to make of it. It didn't seem to suit the Emperor at all. The two of them stared at each other for a long moment as the last traces of power faded away, both unsure of what to say. And it was only as they stood in silence that Isha realized her physical avatar had changed without her notice. Large sections of her skin had hardened and shifted to crystal, as it did for those of her children who lived too long without reincarnating. Her nails had turned to iron, and her red hair now had streaks of white-blue. What in the world? For her avatar to shift without her notice was impossible. Such a thing had not happened since. A spark of alarm ignited in Isha's heart, but she ignored it for now, hastily shifting her form back to normal. She could see the curiosity in the Emperor's eyes, but Isha could not say she particularly felt like indulging it, so she said nothing. At last, the Emperor cleared his throat and spoke. Suppose you are wondering how I created the Dreamstone at last. Yes, Isha admitted. She guessed, of course, but she was curious about the details. I finally heeded your advice, the emperor said, his tone wry and self-deprecating in a way Isha had never heard from him before. I used my love for Horus, for those of my children long dead. You may examine it if you wish. The dreamstone floated forward, and hesitating only for a moment, Isha reached out to grasp it. And yes, what the emperor said was true. This dreamstone was inextricably bound to Horus, the emperor's love and affection for his son crystallized into a single, perfect gem. Well done, she said finally, passing the dreamstone back. She paused to consider her next words, before speaking again. If I may, I believe this first dreamstone should go to Horus himself. It is strongly attuned to him, to your affection for him, and would serve him well. And as the very first of your dreamstones, well, it has a certain significance and power in the warp. The emperor's eyebrows knitted together in thought. A good point, he acknowledged. That awkward silence fell once more as the two of them regarded each other uneasily, both of them conscious of the weight of the contract upon them. Isha could only hope she would not regret this decision. 60. Genesia Kroll had been raised for war. As a young child, she had been abandoned. She did not remember who had abandoned her, only that her earliest memories were of being utterly alone, scraping on the wardern fields of Terra, struggling to survive, all others repelled by her presence for reasons she could not understand. Even among others of her kind, she stood out, because she did not inspire disgust, but was instead outright invisible to most. The average person simply could not even see she was there. She was invisible and forgotten to all, a ghost drifting through the seas of the living, unseen, unheard, and unknown. Then he came. The emperor. He had been the first person who seemed utterly unaffected by her aura, to pierce the loneliness that she had always worn. He had come to her, crouching in front of a small, dirty child eyeing him with shock and fear, and made a simple offer. Come with me, and you will never be alone again. She had agreed, of course. He had given her a new name, discarding the one from her childhood. And ever since, she has been Genesia Kroll. The emperor had molded her as a soldier, taught her the arts of war personally, and tutored her on a dozen different subjects. He shaped her into his talons, the shadowy dagger to the shining spear that was the custodes. And Genesia had always served faithfully, but her reasons for doing so had always been different from other people. Because when the emperor had first come to her, she had not seen the shining golden titan that all others saw. She had not seen a mysterious traveler cloaked in shadows, or even an impossibly ancient, withered old sage as some others claimed to have seen him as. She had just seen a man. An ordinary middle-aged man, with plain features, dark hair streaked with gray and soft brown eyes. And the man had saved her, had given her a purpose in life. Above all, he had seen her. Heard her. No one else had done that, could do that. What more could Genesia ask for? What could anyone ask for? Whatever the emperor did, Genesia would follow him to the ends of the galaxy. Whether he wished to save it or burn it to ash, she would do her best to help accomplish that dream. That was her duty, her mission, her purpose. For years, she had served as the first of his anathema Psychona, and in time she had been joined by more of her kind. The emperor had commanded her to embrace them as her sisters, and she had done so. Some of her loneliness had been alleviated then, as she met others who could understand, who knew something of what her life was like. But she had never met anyone like the emperor. The cults and witches that she had hunted in the emperor's name, the handful of battle psychers employed by the Imperium, Genesia was imperceptible to them all. She was invisible and inaudible to everyone, and even the custodes and Malkador struggled to remember that she existed, to look at her and interact with her. Until her. Lady Isha. The emperor's guest and prisoner. Genesia had known instantly from the moment she laid eyes upon her that Lady Isha was not human. Underneath all the illusions she cloaked herself with was a distinctly inhuman woman, with wooden bark for skin, red leaves for hair, and with claws instead of fingers. But just like the emperor, Isha was unaffected by their aura. While there was a certain wariness to her whenever she was in the presence of Genesia or her sisters, Isha was never uncomfortable or disgusted. It was baffling, confusing. And her influence on the emperor was strange. The emperor listened to her as he had never listened to anyone except Malkador. And Genesia did not know what to make of that. Having escorted Lady Isha to the Emperor's chambers, Zheneshia waited outside with the rest of the escort, for Isha to either emerge or for the Emperor to dismiss them. Several hours after Isha entered, she came out, this time with the Emperor behind her. She was not wearing the shackles anymore and seemed lighter and freer. If anything, the air between the Emperor and his guest seemed different now. Previously, there had been a tension, one that reminded Zheneshia of the eve of battle, where both sides prepared for war and assessed each other before it began. Now, there was still an awkwardness, a weariness, but it no longer felt as if they were about to fight. There was something in Lady Isha's gaze as she looked at the Emperor, a mixture of trepidation and some other emotion that Zheneshia didn't quite recognize. But then eyes flickered and landed directly on Zheneshia, focusing clearly on her without a hint of difficulty or disgust. The alien's gaze softened, something dangerously like pity replacing the previous emotions in her eyes. Nobody had ever looked at her like that. The Emperor and her sisters were the only ones who had ever seen her in truth, and none of them had such softness in their eyes. Zheneshia did not know what to make of it. Isha could not help but pity the Null Maidens. She should have been revolted, perhaps. They were still antithetical to her nature, their mere presence repulsing the energies of the warp. Isha was not even sure they had souls. And she was wary of them. She would be lying if she claimed she was not. The similarities to the Necrons and the Inger were disconcerting enough as it was and made her wonder where in the world they had come from. They were clearly some experiment of the Emperor's, derived from his study of some Necron technology or perhaps even the Void Dragon itself. There was no other explanation for the similarity to Necron null fields. But despite all that, even though they might well be soulless, they were so utterly alone. Rejected by all those around them, with no life left to them except an eternity of war. It reminded her of her children. It reminded her of herself. Weapons bound to the will of a callous master forged for war and no other purpose. And the leader of the Emperor's coterie of Null Maidens was the most tragic of them all, the strength of her aura so great that no mortal could look at her and truly see her. And as the Null Maidens escorted her back to her chamber, Isha could not resist the urge to speak to them. She was curious, and all that aside, even with the contract established, she could not resist the urge to push her boundaries just a little, just to see how the Emperor would react. If he would react at all or just brush it off as nothing important. "Hello," she said gently. Zheneshia's eyes flickered to her, filled with caution and surprise, but she did not respond. Not soulless after all, then. There was more emotion in those eyes than Isha had ever seen from any of the Emperor's custodes. Still, that made her even more curious as to their nature. "I understand if you do not want to talk to me, but I have a few questions for you if you don't mind." Isha probed gently. Zheneshia frowned but made a hand sign that took Isha a moment to interpret. Isha had learned the sign languages of humanity from the books in her library, but this one was a little different, though not indistinguishable. "I cannot tell you any of the Imperium's secrets. And I won't ask you to," Isha assured her as they turned down another hallway. "I simply wanted to ask, at what age were you recruited for this? When did the Emperor transform you into this?" Isha was undeniably curious about the one form of super soldier that the Emperor had told her nothing about. Even with the custodes, their genetic enhancements were at least something she could analyze simply by looking at them. While the Null Maidens were not so powerful as to be invisible to her sight, their strength was sufficient that even for the weakest of them, Isha could not analyze their genetic code with a mere glance. Or at all, without using the same devices and techniques mortals had to rely on. How had the Emperor created them? And it was also a good distraction from the turmoil that had plagued her recently, a reason to not dwell on her most recent conversation with the Emperor and the consequences of their pact. "I was recruited when I was 10, Zheneshia signed. And His Majesty did not make me like this. I was born like this." Isha's mind ground to a halt, and she stopped walking, her escort pausing as well. What?" Isha queried, genuinely astonished. "How is that possible?" Zheneshia did not shrug, but the look she gave Isha certainly gave the impression of it. "I simply was," she responded. "Don't know how." "Nobody does." "I see," Isha responded slowly, her mind whirling with the implications. They resumed walking down the hall, even as Isha tried to unravel this new mystery. Were the blanks the result of some genetic experiment conducted by humanity during their golden age? Some anomaly caused by the void dragon's presence nearby? Something else entirely? Human nulls were an impossibility, one that could not, should not exist. And since the Emperor had promised to treat her as an equal, well, she was certainly going to prod him about this the next time they spoke. "Thank you, Lord Primarch, thank you. The man said, practically crying from relief as he cradled the box of panacea fruits and vials of aqua guaranis in his arms. Horace smiled and gently patted the man on the shoulder. "It's no trouble," he said warmly, patting him on the shoulder. "Take it, it'll heal your entire family. This is what the Imperium is here for." The man beamed and nodded before leaving, and the next person in the queue came forward, an old woman wrapped in a green shawl, looking uncertain. Horace turned to the side to give her a box, only to realize there were none. "Please wait," he told the old woman before briefly turning to the Knight of the Order Hospitaller whose stand he was sharing, Sir Alexos. The old knight nodded, and Horace offered a smile to the people in the queue before making his way inside the Talosian building the Imperium had appropriated as a distribution center. The instant he was inside, though, Horace's lips twisted into a scowl, his smile fading away as he marched through the halls, the other knights and acolytes in the white and gold robes and uniforms of the Order scurrying away from him. He had been working with the Order for a few days now since his father and Lady Isha had departed on some urgent matter. And it wasn't quite what he had expected. He had grasped the concepts and methods easily enough. How to stitch wounds, to administer medicines, to monitor patients, the logistics of the food distribution, none of it was beyond him. But it was all tedious. This was time and effort and resources that could have been spent on the next conquest, on the next campaign. The food and medicines would have served the army on the march as well as did all these civilians. Father had explained it all to him, of course, and Horace could not honestly say he was wrong, but he also found it difficult to muster any true passion for this work, and he didn't see how anyone else could. He did like the gratefulness and appreciation all his patients showered him with, but it didn't make up for the tediousness of having to tend to the fragile mortals, the sobbing and the moaning, the lack of any real excitement. It was just boring. Still, he had asked for this, and it would be embarrassing to tell his father that he didn't want to do this just because he was bored. So Horace grudgingly went about his work, stomping down the halls to fetch more food and medicine to distribute from the stores. Reaching the storage rooms, Horace grumpily grabbed several crates, far more than any ordinary man could either carry or balance. But as he made his way back, marching through the building and out to the stall, he was surprised to see that there was someone else standing there, the old woman behind him. And it was someone taller than him. Much taller. Easily as tall as Captain General Van Daler himself, clad in the ramshackle blue armor of the Thunder Warriors, the figure loomed far above Horace, a plumed helmet cradled under one arm. His skin was leathery, and his face was marked with scars and a thick beard, his dark cropped hair short and streaked with gray. But his storm-gray eyes were clear and piercing, fixed on Horace. Ashotan, legate of the 4th Legion, Horace remembered from his lessons on the Imperium's highest generals. "So this is the Lord Primarch?" Ashotan asked, his tone insouciant, bordering on insolent. The legate was regarding Horace with an amused smirk, a condescending spark in his eyes. Horace had seen that expression directed at other people. Had used it on people. But nobody had ever directed it at him. Ashotan made a show of looking Horace up and down. "I have to say, I was expecting someone more impressive." Horace bristled, unable to tolerate this in front of so many people. "Show some respect," he hissed. "I'm a Primarch, the Emperor's son." "I noticed," Ashotan said, looking distinctly unimpressed. "What about it?" Horace puffed up indignantly, before forcing himself to calm down. He shouldn't make a scene in front of all these people. And he didn't need to rely on his father's name for respect either. "Why are you here, legate?" Horace said evenly, mustering the regal person with the aristocratic air that his tutors had taught him. "I didn't realize a legate of the Thunder Warriors had the time to waste on this instead of tending to his duties." Ashotan hummed in amusement. "I heard that our Golden Emperor's precious son was making a fool of himself, and I had to come to see it for myself." The young Primarch's lips drew back in a snarl. He knew these sorts of men and had dealt with them on Thonia many times. They respected strength and nothing else. If he was still on Thonia, Horus would have challenged Ushotan to a fight, to prove that he was worthy of his respect. But he could already imagine his father's disapproving frown if he did anything like that here. The people were already staring at them, not just the citizens who had come for their food and medicine, but also the other members of the Order Hospitaller, from Alexos to the knights manning the other stalls. Ushotan's smirk widened at Horus's visible annoyance. "Well, Lord Primarch," he drawled. "If you'll be so gracious as to tell me why you're here, I'll leave you alone." Horus glowered at him, setting the crates down. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he hissed. "You don't," the legate agreed amiably. "And I don't have anything to do today except stay and watch you." Hands curling into fists, Horus's glare intensified, and everyone else backed away from the two of them, but Ushotan seemed entirely unaffected, simply crossing his arms. What did he want? "I'm here because I was curious about the Order Hospitaller," Horus ground out. "I wanted to see their work." "Ah, so this is just you passing the time, then? Got bored on the fancy ship, eh?" "That's not what I said," Horus snapped, conscious of the many people around to hear Ushotan's accusations. "But it's the truth," Ushotan said, his smirk fading away, replaced by disdain. "You don't actually care about their work, you're just here because you wanted to amuse yourself." "Don't pretend as if you care." Horus spat back, stung by both Ushotan's words and the stares of everyone present. "You're just one of my father's warhounds. I've seen the records of what you've done. As if you care about the work the Order is doing here." "A few years ago, you would have been right," Ushotan admitted, scratching his beard. "Hell, even now. I'll admit it, I'm a killer. Always have been, even before I became one of your father's hounds. This business of healing and protecting, it's not what I am. But that doesn't mean I can't see why it's important." Horus rolled his eyes, doing his best to clamp down on his temper and present himself as unaffected. Ushotan was just here to poke at him, trying to annoy Horus for his own amusement. He should have realized that sooner. "I know why it's important," Horus said curtly, tailoring his words to the audience. "It helps keep the people happy, and shows them the benefits of being part of the Imperium, that we'll treat them well, unlike the monsters who ruled over them before." "That's all true," Ushotan acknowledged, peering down at Horus, the spark of mockery gone, replaced by something else, something almost knowing. "But it's not the only reason." "And what's that?" Horus questioned sardonically, refusing to be goaded into losing his temper again. "You won't believe me if I tell you, brat," Ushotan told him. "You'll have to figure it out for yourself. Your father seems to have done it even though I never thought he would, maybe you will too." Horus sneered. "Whatever." Ushotan shrugged. "Oh, well, it's not my business." "Good luck, O Lord Primarch," he said, raising his helmet over his head. "You're going to need it." With that, the legate of the 4th Legion left, walking away with thunderous footsteps, as Horus scowled at his back, realizing something. He still didn't know what the Thunder Warrior had wanted. Check the description for the links to the author.